You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
A lot of the subtext around energy discussions is on energy independence, and there's no denying it. This isn't just some standard little political fight like anything else we see, but there's a bigger agenda that's often at work here from people that are hell-bent on not just minimizing, but in some cases destroying the energy sector in Canada. And one aspect of this that hasn't gotten a lot of coverage is the battle in the Arctic region. But I want to talk about oil and gas sector development in the energy sector a little bit more broadly here. Deidra Garyk is an independent energy advocate who's done tremendous research on this that you'd think the mainstream media would be doing, but certainly aren't. She joins me now. Deidra, thanks for coming on. Good to talk to you.
Well, thank you for having me, Andrew.
Now, I've had the opportunity to hear you speak about some of your work a couple of months back, and I said I wanted to get you on the show because you're delving into things that, as I mentioned, a lot of people simply aren't. What got you looking into this, first off?
Well, actually, it was a friend who had mentioned to me that they have some evidence to suggest that perhaps there is some sort of concerted effort happening in the Arctic to constrain or just choke off shipping in the Arctic altogether, which had sort of come out as a result of Bill C-48, the West Coast tanker ban. And so over a number of months, I sort of started delving into things, just really doing simple Google searches. So you're absolutely right. I mean, this is something any media outlet could have found. And so once I started to sort of peel back the layers of the onion, and I could start to see that there really was, very material funding going to some well-known ENGO groups, I could see that, yes, there is potentially something here. They're quite sophisticated in that they're not always entirely transparent about what their plans are. But once I discovered that the World Wildlife Fund had received about $900,000 US in funding from the Switzerland-based Oak Foundation with the express purpose of trying to put in regulations to constrain shipping and to stop development in the Arctic, I knew that there was a story here. There was something more going on than what people might see. And I think, as we all know, with the egress constraints, pipeline constraints going east and west, many people in the oil and gas sector and energy sector, it could be transmission lines, et cetera, are looking at different options, including the Arctic. So the Port of Churchill and Port Nelson have been on the radar for a number of years. And so that was the other reason I said, well, if there is an effort to constrain shipping out of the Arctic, maybe this just isn't an option that we have. And it appears that there could be something here. And so I'm trying to sort of understand what is happening up there.
One thing we saw, this is going back to, I think, early 2020 with Tech Frontier, is that a lot of companies just don't want to deal with political fights. They want to come, they're in the building industry, they're not in the politics industry. So the resistance you get from activist groups, well-funded activist groups, as you note, can actually have an effect if companies are finding that they're having to spend all their time on lobbying and political capital and not actually putting things in the ground.
Absolutely. I think there is a real misconception out there that the oil and gas industry, big oil as it's often termed, spends millions and millions of dollars lobbying and fighting to just sort of develop freely and destroy the environment. And that's just simply not true. We know that ENGOs have received millions of dollars in funding with the express purpose of trying to stop development. Oil and gas companies are doing what they can to run their business, to develop their business. And so you're right, lobbying and activism, advocacy is not a strength of the industry. I always say the industry has never had to advertise to sell its product. So we've never had to be advocates and try to explain why that product is valuable. And so I think that's why the messaging maybe has gotten away and why there has been such successful pushback.
And one point as well, just on that dollar value. So this is just one particular grant that you've mentioned, the World Wildlife Fund getting $881,000. In a lot of cases, that's more than is going towards promoting these projects.
Oh, absolutely. I'm an independent energy advocate. I've done my writing, my research, my presenting all on my own time and dime. I haven't been paid. And there's many of us like me out there just trying to educate and get the message out.
So let me ask then about the Arctic specifically, because we often hear so much of the discourse around a lot of the more lower Canada, well, not in the sense of Quebec, but lower Canada in the sense of geographically, projects, Keystone XL, Enbridge, Trans Mountain. What's happening in the Arctic?
Well, there are two groups right now. One of them is called the Peacemaker Pipeline Project, which is led by the First Peoples Pipeline. They received $500,000 in funding from the Saskatchewan government in September of last year. And that's to look at the feasibility of building an energy corridor to the Port of Churchill. Now, there's also another group called the Nistanon Group that is looking at building an energy corridor of pipelines, transmission lines, as well as rail to Port Nelson. So we know that there's an active interest in the energy sector in general, not just oil and gas, but energy, to find some egress options to go up to the Arctic. However, we can see through what's publicly disclosed on the NGO's websites that they are actively looking to constrain shipping, stop any sort of development, particularly oil and gas. They're very, very transparent about wanting to stop oil and gas development. And they also want to get rid of all diesel and heating oil use in the Arctic and replace it with renewables. For the most part, wind and solar are listed as the two main sources, but we do know that they are trying to replace any sort of diesel or heating oil stoves or heating sources with biomass. Now, the other thing is we know that they are actively working with the government to try and implement marine protected areas, marine refuges, create culturally significant marine areas, anything that will end up constraining shipping, if not completely choking it off altogether. There is a map that I found online that has the entire Hudson Strait listed as a culturally significant marine area. And so, that could potentially mean no shipping there, no traffic of any sort, meaning that if you have any sort of energy corridor to Churchill or Port Nelson, you can't get in or out. So it really renders all of that work futile.
One thing that I would ask about here, because a lot of the language around this is couched in terms of very good sounding things, significant marine areas, marine refuge, marine protected areas. No one wants to think of destroying wildlife and natural habitats in pursuit of money. What's the response to that?
Well, honestly, the oil and gas sector in particular has been known. We're very transparent about it. We do spend a lot on environmental protection. I think there is a huge misunderstanding that the oil and gas sector just goes in and destroys the environment and just doesn't care, gets what it wants, and it just walks away. And that's just simply not true. In Canada, there's a lot of really strict regulations, even though it's regulated by province. Our three main oil and gas producing provinces, BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, do have very stringent environmental regulations. And so I think it's just a misconception that we don't care. We have tankers that are very sophisticated that prevent spills. And so I think to go out and say that, we have to cut all of this off is really, I think, misguided and misinforming the public in general.
And one point as well, to bring it into the realm of federal politics, is that the federal government, which we know has never met a regulation on the energy sector it didn't like, has set a target, which again does not get a lot of coverage at all as far as how much of Canada's water it wants to preserve and protect. Again, sounds noble on the surface, but they want to increase that. And when you talk about that map, which we put up on the screen, that will only shrink the areas in which this sector can work.
Yes, absolutely. And I want to be very clear. I support conservation. I even support a diverse energy mix where it makes sense. So this isn't about me just being very pro-development with no consequences. And I think that I'm fairly representative of the oil and gas sector in general. That's not what I want. And so yes, I think there are very legitimate reasons to put certain regulations and conservation areas in place. However, I agree with you. When we start to just create these ginormous conservation areas, then it really does impact development, and that impacts all Canadians. If indeed there is no development allowed up in the Arctic, that really does impact the ability for Indigenous communities to get jobs and to prosper. And I think that is part of the conversation that is left out when these groups go up and try to get rid of oil and gas development and implement renewables and other things like that.
Well, that's actually a tremendously important point, because in the media, the discourse around this is that you've got oil and gas sector versus Indigenous communities, because you do have a few Indigenous communities, especially out in British Columbia, that are very much devoted against these sorts of projects. But the Indigenous communities where the projects are taking place almost exclusively are supporting them. And that seems to be true in the North as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there have been some very courageous, vocal Indigenous leaders who have spoken up in support to try to say, look, there is another side to this story. You might have seen that there was a leader that just spoke out against Jane Fonda protesting Line 3 and the oil sands. Stephen Buffalo from the Indian Resource Council. He's really
fantastic.
Strong advocate. So we are seeing that, but I think those voices are not being heard enough. They're not being given the platform to present a different side to this, and I think that's a disservice to the conversation in general.
Deidra Garyk is an energy advocate talking about the stories that more people should, so happy to play my small part by talking about them with her. Deidra, thank you so much for coming on. Great to speak with you.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew. I really appreciate this.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.